On October 12, 1997, bystanders standing along the shore of Monterey Bay, California, watched in horror as a small aircraft began to wobble in the sky before plunging nose first into the water at terrifying speed. Within seconds, the surface of the sea closed over it, as though nothing had happened at all. The man at the controls was no unknown pilot. It was John Denver, the artist who had once made an entire nation sing along to gentle melodies about nature, love, and the open road. A voice that had convinced millions the world could be a more peaceful place ended in a moment of sudden, chilling violence. Yet that ending was only the final chapter in a life defined by contradiction. John Denver was born Henry John Deutschendorf Jr. on December 31st, 1943, in Roswell, New Mexico. His father, Henry Dutch Deutschendorf Sr., was a pilot in the United States Air Force, and that career dictated the family's life, a constant cycle of moving between military bases scattered across the country. For young Henry, there was no hometown, no lasting circle of friends, no sense of roots. Each time he grew accustomed to a new place, it was already time to leave. Music entered his life quietly through a guitar his grandmother gave him. In the strict atmosphere of a military household, that simple instrument opened an entirely different world. He would spend hours alone, slowly working out folk and country chords, finding in those simple melodies a private refuge from perpetual uprooting of his childhood. The family eventually settled in Texas, where Denver attended Texas Tech University. But the classroom couldn't hold him. Music had taken over too much of his attention, and the idea of an academic career grew increasingly hollow. He made the risky decision to drop out and head to California, carrying his guitar and a handful of songs, aiming to find a place among the hundreds of young folk musicians competing for attention on the small stages of the mid-1960s. It was there that he chose a new name. He called himself John Denver, a tribute to the Colorado Rocky Mountains, which had left a profound impression on him. At the time, it was simply the decision of a young man trying to carve out an identity. Later, it would become something far more significant. In 1965, Denver got his first real break when he was invited to join the folk group the Mitchell Trio, replacing founding member Chad Mitchell. It was his first door into the professional music industry, and life quickly shifted rhythm. Continuous touring carried him through dozens of cities, night after night on different stages, slowly training him in the most essential skill a performer can have, how to hold an audience. During the quieter hours between shows, Denver kept writing. He carried a small notebook everywhere, jotting down melodies on buses, in hotel rooms, during empty afternoons after performances. One of the songs that emerged from those years was Leaving on a Jet Plane, a simple melody carrying a quiet sadness about departure and uncertainty. He passed it to the folk trio Peter, Paul, and Mary, who recorded it. When their version was released, Denver was still an unknown. But by 1969, the song had climbed to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, sold millions of copies, and put his name on the radar of the music industry. That year, Denver also released his first solo album, Rhymes and Reasons. It carried everything that drew him to folk music: acoustic guitar, gentle melodies, understated lyrics. But the musical landscape had shifted dramatically. Electric rock and psychedelic sounds dominated the radio. The album nearly disappeared. Sales were low, responses were muted, and many in the industry began to regard him as simply a songwriter who had written one lucky hit. A second album in 1970, Take Me to Tomorrow, met the same fate. While his composition had become a major hit for someone else, his own records could not find their audience. Denver existed in a strange liminal zone, admired in songwriting circles, but invisible to the wider public. Then 1971 arrived, and everything changed. The album Poems, Prayers, and Promises introduced a song that seemed to arrive from a different universe than the electronic noise surrounding it. Take Me Home, Country Roads. Built on humble images of rural Appalachia and a rhythm that felt both ancient and immediate, it tapped into a sense of homesickness, so strong that listeners felt they were longing for a place they had never even lived. The song climbed to #2 on the Billboard Hot 100. The album sold over 1 million copies. Concert halls began filling. Promoters started calling. In 1972, Rocky Mountain High deepened the connection. The The title track painted images of open skies, snow-covered peaks, and a feeling of something close to absolute freedom. Some radio stations hesitated. The word high seemed suspicious in an era sensitive to drug references, but audiences paid no attention to the controversy. The album entered the top 10, and the song gradually became a cultural symbol, one the state of Colorado would later place among its official songs. By 1973, Denver's rise had become something beyond a music industry story. The album Farewell Andromeda entered the market and sold quickly from its first weeks. Concert tours expanded into larger venues, where audiences came not just to hear music, but to experience the feeling his songs carried, a sense of vast, untouched nature, of a simpler and purer America that many believed was slowly disappearing. The consecutive successes of the early 1970s pushed Denver into a different category entirely. In 1974, Back Home Again arrived, filled with its familiar acoustic warmth. It also contained something more personal. Annie's song, written for his wife Annie Martell in a burst of inspiration after a day of skiing in Aspen, composed almost entirely in just a few minutes. Upon release, the song reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Millions heard in its simple, drifting melody a form of love rarely expressed so plainly in popular music. The album earned multi-platinum certification, and Denver became a permanent fixture on the major performance circuit. That same year, he was awarded the CMA Entertainer of the Year. For listeners, it seemed obvious. For parts of Nashville, it was controversial. Many traditional country artists felt his music was too soft, too close to pop, lacking the rougher edge they considered essential to the genre. Denver became a figure both celebrated and disputed, caught between public admiration and industry skepticism. In 1975, I'm Sorry from the album Wind Song reached number 1, making him one of the very few folk country artists with multiple songs at the top of the pop charts. The album sold over 3 million copies. In 1976, Denver began performing in large stadiums. Tens of thousands of fans gathered below a single man with an acoustic guitar. What struck many observers was that even as the scale expanded, the music itself remained as simple as it had ever been. By 1977, his compilation John, Denver's Greatest Hits, had sold over 10 million copies, one of the best-selling albums of the decade. But the music industry doesn't hold still. As the late 1970s approached, rock grew louder, disco exploded, and younger audiences shifted toward different sounds. Denver's music remained faithful to its roots: acoustic guitar, quiet melodies, images of nature. What had made him distinctive now placed him outside the emerging wave. His 1978 album, I Want to Live, inspired by environmental concerns he held deeply, still found loyal listeners but failed to reach the commercial heights of his mid-decade peak. Autograph in 1979 was more personal and introspective, but mainstream audiences had moved on. The early 1980s confirmed the shift. Country music itself was changing, moving toward a more polished, pop-influenced sound, and Denver's acoustic folk aesthetic felt increasingly out of step. He kept experimenting. In 1983, It's About Time incorporated stronger pop and soft rock elements, an attempt to reach new audiences. But it pleased no one entirely. Long-time listeners found it unfamiliar. Younger listeners still viewed him as an artist from an earlier era. None of the songs produced a hit powerful enough to return him to the charts. Even as his commercial standing declined, Denver remained a significant public figure. In 1985, his name appeared in an unexpected place: a hearing room of the United States Senate. An organization called the Parents Music Resource Center was pushing for warning labels on music albums. Most assumed the opposition would come from rebellious rock performers. Instead, one of the loudest voices against the policy was John Denver, long considered one of the gentlest figures in American music. Standing before the senators, he argued that warning labels risked opening a path toward artistic censorship. He had experienced the danger firsthand. Rocky Mountain High had once been viewed with suspicion by radio stations for its title alone. Labels, he believed, would allow music to be judged before it was ever heard. The image of a man known for songs about mountains and country roads defending creative freedom surprised many observers. To Denver, it was simply a matter of principle. He continued releasing music through the late 1980s, and into the 1990s. International tours increasingly filled his schedule, in Europe and Japan especially. His acoustic melodies found enthusiastic audiences even when American charts had moved on. Songs he had written years earlier still landed with power on stages in Tokyo and across Europe. His 1990 album, The Flower That Shattered the Stone, found more of its audience abroad than at home. Throughout those years of fame, Denver's private life carried its own quiet turbulence. He had married Annie Martell in 1967, when he was still an obscure musician playing small venues. She stood beside him through his most difficult years, the long tours, the albums nobody bought, the slow grind toward recognition. When success finally arrived, it brought with it a new rhythm that slowly pulled them apart. Concert schedules, constant travel, and media appearances kept Denver away from home for extended stretches. Annie, living in Aspen, found herself increasingly alone as her husband came to belong more to the public than to the family. They adopted 2 children, Zachary and Anna Kate, and Denver wrote with evident tenderness about fatherhood. But the fractures in the marriage accumulated quietly over years. There were periods of separation, intense arguments, and incidents, including a notorious moment when Denver, in a burst of anger, used a chainsaw to cut their bed in half that contradicted every image his music projected. They divorced in 1982, after nearly 15 years together. The melodies celebrating their love continued playing on the radio while the real relationship had moved somewhere else entirely. Denver later married Cassandra Delaney, an Australian actress and entertainer. He met during a 1985 concert tour. Their daughter, Jessie Belle Denver, was born in 1989, but geographic distance, different professional worlds, and the old patterns of constant travel created new fractures. That marriage ended in 1993 as well. In the same year, Denver was arrested in Colorado for driving under the influence of alcohol. For audiences who had long associated him with purity and gentleness, it felt like a crack in a portrait they had believed was nearly perfect. He pleaded guilty, had his license suspended, which affected one of his deepest passions, and continued on. Flying had been a part of Denver's life for many years. In the air, with the sound of wind and engine filling the cockpit, the pressures of fame fell temporarily behind. No audiences, no schedules, no interviews, only the open sky above the Rocky Mountains. In autumn 1997, he purchased a Rutan Long Easy, a small experimental aircraft known for its distinctive design. He had owned it for only about 2 weeks. On the afternoon of October 12th, he took off from Pacific Grove Airfield near Monterey. The sky was relatively clear. People near the coast saw the aircraft gliding low along the rocky shoreline of the Monterey Peninsula. Not long after leaving the runway, it tilted sharply and struck the water at tremendous speed. The wreckage sank quickly. The Coast Guard arrived within minutes. There was nothing to be done. The investigation focused on the aircraft's unusual fuel transfer system. To switch tanks, the pilot had to reach behind his shoulder inside a narrow cockpit, sometimes loosening his seatbelt and taking his hands from the controls. Experts concluded that Denver may have attempted this maneuver during the flight. Toxicology tests confirmed there was no alcohol or drugs in his system. News of his death spread across the United States within hours. Television networks interrupted programming. Radio stations began replaying Country Roads and Rocky Mountain High. For many Americans, it wasn't simply the loss of a famous singer. It was the loss of a voice bound up in memories of long drives, family, and the American landscape.